Okay. Welcome everybody to this round table on anarchism and the national question. My name is Marko Antonsic and I'm the convener of LUN, is the Loughborough University Nationalism Network. I'm very grateful today to Ruth Kinna from Loughborough and Jose Antonio Gutierrez for bringing together colleagues from various universities. I'm not sure whether they are from all over the world or for sure there is a very international panel. And today we are basically trying to pull out the key themes, the key arguments that were presented by these contributors to the thematic section, which was recently published in Nations and Nationalism. So each speaker, rather than making just a summary of their own paper, they would try to flesh out what the key arguments are. First, there would be Ruth and Jose offering a general introduction for about 10 minutes. Introducing this thematic issue, and then we will go author by author, and we plan each author to talk about 5 minutes each. Questions and comments will be left at the end of the all presentations. We are aiming for finishing around 5:30. The point is not so much the time, but to have a enjoyable conversation. So if you want, obviously, you can open the microphone at the end and ask your own question, or if you prefer, you can just post the question in the chat. But ideally, it's nice, actually. I personally would prefer when someone can open the microphone and have the question. Meanwhile, please, everybody, just mute yourself, unless obviously you're going to be the speaker. And let me pass now the microphone to Ruth and Jose for introducing this thematic issue. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marco. Thanks for coordinating this, and also to Brigitte for setting up the Eventbrite. Hello, everybody. I'm going to be speaking first, and then I'm going to hand over to Jose. And our aim is to provide a broad sort of introduction, if you like, to the papers that we've collected in this issue of Nations and Nationalism, this special issue of Nations and Nationalism. And I suppose our primary aim really was to bring anarchism back into dialogue with nationalism, because anarchism is typically ignored or passed over in nationalism studies, tends to get conflated with Marxism, and we think that there's a gap, a historical gap to fill, and a historical gap that will allow us then to think differently, if you like, about some contemporary national movements. So I'm going to talk about the history and the way in which we've contextualized anarchism and nationalism, and then I'll hand over to Jose. Broadly speaking, the way that we set the history up is to think about the relationship between anarchists and republicans in the 19th century. And we argue that anarchists broadly embraced republican tropes of liberation and non-domination, but what they did was promote an anti-state internationalist vision of in company with mainstream republicanism. So the power of the church and empire, they proposed federal solutions to organisation, the devolution of power, self-determination or self-government, autonomy and rights of secession. So all of these things were also embedded in republican thought. But the difference with the anarchists was that anarchists argued that the state could never be a realm of peace and freedom. It was necessarily a system of domination. So when P.J. Proudhon, who's often regarded as the sort of one of the forerunners or the important sort of advocates of anarchy in the 19th century, when he described the nation as an association that commanded, quote, both force and virtue, what he did was pinpoint a fundamental tension between the aspiration for nationhood and the construction of the state, or the constitution of the state. So on his view, nationhood encapsulated a demand for freedom and independence that was negated by the state's hierarchical organisation and by the competitive logics of capitalism and the international system. So his proposal was to anarchize the Republican social contract by recognizing the sovereign right of individuals and the collective force of their association, and by this means to constitute themselves, if they liked, as nations. Now, subsequent anarchists elaborated Proudhon's critique and adopted conceptions of decentralized federalism to reject the institutions of government, and they struggled to transform established constitutional arrangements. And at this point, of course, they pitched themselves definitely in opposition to constituted republican governments. I mean, notably in France in 1870 and 71, in the form of the resistance of the Commune. But in doing so, they did not reject national self-determination. What they wanted to do was alter the basis on which national struggles were waged. Now, we don't argue or we suggest that that anarchism or the relationship between anarchism and nationalism was not without its tensions. So we admit that there is an affinity, if you like, between anarchism and nationalism, but that it's not a smooth one. So we note that anarchists disagreed about which kinds of national struggles they wanted to support, whether they wanted to support them at all. They also argued about the politics of international power relations, notably in 1914, when the anarchist movement pretty much split on the issue of nationalism and internationalism. They also struggled in their daily practices, as Constance and Pietro show, to delineate the relationship between national organising and internationalism. So there were a lot of tensions that the anarchists were wrestling with, but we consider these to be productive tensions and worthy of further attention. We also argue that anarchists produced biting and enduring critiques of patriotism, as well as of militarism and imperialism, and they exposed in powerful ways the manner in which patriotism and nationalism and militarism were enculturated through state and church-led national education programs, the media, and the arts. So, if you like, they had a sense of banal nationalism early on, but they associated it with the state. So before I hand over to Jose, I just want to say, the point about the history or recovering the history of anarchism and republicanism is important in itself, I think. But for us, it's important too because it allows us to think about the ways in which anarchism continues to resonate in national movements, and that the struggles that we'd want to emphasise here are the anarchist engagements in the politics of national liberation in, for example, the Zapatista movement, or the expressions of anarchism in the Zapatista movement in Mexico, in indigenous movements in North and Latin America, as Ivana will talk about, and as Jose will also talk about in the Catalan process in recent years. We also think that unless we have unless we attend to the relationship between nationalism and anarchism, we can't really make sense of movements like the Kurdish movement in Rojava, which is still struggling to decentralize and confederalize along the lines recommended by the anarchist and social ecologist Murray Bookchin. Okay, I'll hand over to Jose.
Okay, thank you very much, Ruth, and apologies to everybody in attendance here because my camera unfortunately is not working today, and I have some works going on in the background, so I'm sure you're hearing the drills and all, and I apologize for all that, but there's very little I can do at the moment. So just to take over where Ruth left, okay, yes, this special issue, we thought it was very important because there's been a lack of communication between anarchist studies and nationalism studies, despite a long operative but interactions nonetheless, and we thought that that's a big gap that has not been explored, and both anarchist studies have bypassed nationalism studies and vice versa. So we thought it was an interesting thing to look into and to see what we could learn from it. So I think, and I think it's something that we put and we emphasize very well with Ruth, that probably one of the reasons why anarchist studies have ignored nationalism studies to a great degree, it's because of the transnational character of the anarchist movement and its commitment to internationalism. Now, all that is true and good, but this idea to look into this aspect grew actually out of transnationalism studies of anarchism, in which we explore the persistence of some sort of national characteristics to different movements task. We are not reinventing the wheel in a way. We had some very good precedents, and I think that we need to talk here about, for instance, Benedict Anderson, particularly his book on the Three Flags, in which he engaged with the importance or this interaction between Republican forms of nationalism in the 19th century and anarchism. Now, the big problem with this book, and this is one of the things that we wanted to address in this special issue, is that there was lack of engagement, not only with some very relevant anarchist experience in the cases he analyzes, in particular the Cuban anarchist movement and its engagement to the independentist struggle in 1898, but also it failed to engage seriously with anarchist theory. That is, he saw in a way that the interaction between those Republicans and anarchists was merely the resort to terrorist actions and the resort to some forms of extreme and radical forms of direct action. But he failed to ignore in all its depth the theoretical overlaps and possible and potential interactions. Then it came a volume edited in 2010 by Lucian van der Waal and Stephen Hirsch, which sent as well a very good precedent in terms of, in a way, putting the record straight about anarchist participation in the anti-colonial struggle. And I think that the anti-colonial engagement and the anti-imperialist engagement of anarchism comes across very clearly in that book, and that's a very valuable precedent. But again, as we said, we noted a very conspicuous lack of engagement with nationalism studies and that interaction between anarchism and nationalism studies. David Porter is another case in question. His book Eyes to the South, it's a marvelous monograph on the attitudes of French anarchists in relation to the Algerian national question. We're talking here about the 50s and the 60s, and yet again, the lack of engagement with nationalism studies, it's something that really comes to the fore. So why do we think it is important? We think that establishing this dialogue is important both for anarchist studies and for nationalism studies, in the sense that it complicates the narratives of both movements in a way. I mean, like for anarchist studies, I think it really complicates certain narratives that spring out from this transnational and the transnational nature of the movement and the internationalist commitments of the movement. It complicates them because it shows, as my friend nationalisms, how there is a persistence of national identities and a persistence of national of even forms of banal nationalism even within a transnational and highly internationalist movement. And second, it is important as well for nationalism studies because this interaction with anarchism helps to complicate and bring nuance to those narratives that conflate nations and state building, or nations and states. It also shows that there's other forms of cooperation association that are outside the framework of the state, which goes against a little bit against some of the underlying assumptions of some versions of banal nationalism. And last but not least, it complicates as well this, in particular in socialism studies, this conflation that nations is something that depends on class relations, and when you get rid of the class system, then nations will disappear. I think that the anarchist outlook and the anarchist perspective brings great nuance on that. So although we do not believe that there's a canon about anarchism and the national question, and there's not even an attempt to establish a canon, to establish a dogma or a set and fixed theory, there are some coherent principles, okay, that are derived from the anarchist outlook, and they're applied in very practical ways into the different circumstances which anarchists found themselves. And they're mostly revolve around three main issues. One, it's the very strong anti-colonial commitment of anarchism. Secondly, it's anti-statist commitment, and thirdly, it's federalist credentials. So those elements bring to the fore a very comprehensive view of self-determination that goes beyond the idea of a nation as a fixed thing, but self-determination is seen at all levels, at the political level, at the economical level, at the cultural level, at the personal level, and so on and so forth. And I think that those principles come across very neatly in the papers that are there in this wonderful special issue. And I just want to finish there and now let the paper speak by themselves. But before we're finishing this section with Ruth, of course, I want to also say thanks to some people that were involved in the process. And I think it is very important to keep them in mind. And Marco, thank not only for putting this together, but also for all the process of internal peer review that you help us do. Marco, Daniel Ternilo, Clelia Clini, Lina Neuhagen, Sinisha Milicevic, they all helped us wonderfully in this task. So I just want to say a big thanks before we proceed with the papers. And also I want to just to mention, last but not least, that this is done, this special issue was done in the memory of two wonderful academics and human beings, which are Bert Altena and Arif Dirlik, who sadly passed away a few years ago, the two of them. So it's very important because they paved the way for many of us in these reflections. So wherever they are, thank you very much as well, guys. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Ruth. Very kind words. Let's now move to the individual papers. Let me give the microphone to Kenyon Zimmers from University of Texas. He's going to talk about national subjects and subversive subjectivity, deportation, and the paradox of the anarchist citizen in the era of the first Red Scare. Microphones to you, Kenyon. 5 minutes for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, let me first very quickly thank Ruth and Jose, everyone else involved in this special issue, and as well as convening this roundtable. So my contribution, this article examines the clash between anarchist anti-nationalism and state efforts to define nations and enforce national sovereignty during the era of the first Red Scare, which was a period when the United States deported between 1919 and 1925. So on the one side of this clash, under international law and statist understandings, all people are supposed to belong to a sovereign nation state as a citizen or subject. Anarchism, of course, on the other side, is predicated on the rejection of the legitimacy of state sovereignty. So this clash of ideas tended to confound legal regimes and bureaucracies that could understand national belonging and individual rights only in terms of citizenship. And citizenship is a somewhat paradoxical thing that, on the one hand, grants states virtually unlimited authority to expel radical non-citizens from their territories, but it also requires those same states to accept deported radicals from elsewhere and incorporate them into the national body. So my article explores how radicals and governments in this era attempted to bend or break these rules in their own favor, with mixed success for both sides. The first half of the article analyzes transcripts of arrested immigrant anarchists when they were interrogated by American immigration inspectors. These were encounters that literally brought anti-statists and agents of the state face to face. And they reveal 4 main strategies employed by the radical detainees, which engaged with discourses of national belonging and citizenship in different ways. Most of those simply denied holding anarchist beliefs or belonging to radical organizations in an effort to pass themselves off as potential members of the national community and avoid deportation. A second group of detainees tended to avoid explicitly labeling themselves or their beliefs as anarchist and hence deportable, but still articulated core anarchist principles, which often led to rather amusing back and forth exchanges between detainees and authorities, often to the frustration of those officials. A third group proudly and defiantly voiced their political ideology in anti-nationalism, often declaring, for example, that they were citizens of the world, Or as one member of the anarcho-syndicalist Union of Russian Workers of the United States and Canada summed it up, I consider myself a citizen and a laborer wherever I work and wherever I live. Another Cuban-born anarchist deportee, when asked why he failed to apply for U.S. citizenship after living in the country for 16 years, simply replied, I do not even believe in my own country. So here we get little glimpses of these sort of lived anti-nationalist beliefs. A final group of detainees made calculated decisions to invoke citizenship and national belonging, either to prevent deportation by making claims upon their own naturalized U.S. citizenship, or to facilitate their deportation to destinations of their own choice. So one example is a group of women whose husbands and partners had been deported to Russia, who themselves took out sworn affidavits attesting to their own anarchist beliefs and deportability in order to, in many cases, successfully force the government to deport them at taxpayer expense to Russia to be reunited with their loved ones. So obviously, those who claimed citizenship either in the United States or Russia or elsewhere didn't necessarily believe that citizenship was a legitimate claim. It was rather an instrumental one that some used. So the second half of the article then compares strategies pursued by governments of the United States, Soviet Russia, and fascist Italy to try to grapple with their own native-born citizen anarchists who were undeportable. And they tended to attempt to do this through incarceration and internal exile to very different degrees across the three countries. In Russia, many anarchist deportees ended up being imprisoned, executed, sent to the Gulag, initially in the early years of the revolution, if they voiced opposition to the Bolshevik regime. And later in the 1930s, those who had escaped those early purges, perhaps joined the Communist Party, later fell victim to Stalin's purges. In Italy, the pre-existing system of internal exile and forced residency was turned against nearly every Italian Red Scare deportee who were almost all placed under surveillance immediately upon repatriation, facing in prison, forced detention, house arrest, etc. The United States, which had more deeply ingrained liberal traditions of free speech, had more difficulty actualizing efforts to contain native-born anarchists. So we only see inconsistently enforced state-level criminal anarchy and criminal syndicalism laws put into place. So to summarize, my contribution argues that in order to enforce categories of citizenship and nationality, states produced new anomalies, anti-nationalist citizens, undocumented exiles, and functionally stateless persons. So national borders turned out to be double-edged swords that paradoxically prevented the entry of some anarchists, facilitated the removal of others, and prevented the expulsion of still more. So when faced with self-proclaimed citizens of the world, national sovereignty sometimes became its own undoing.
Thank you, Kenyon. We go now to Tom Goyens, Salisbury University, presenting a paper, Anarchist and National Identity, the Case of German Radicals in the United States and Brazil, 1880-1945. Microphone to you, Tom. Thanks.
Okay, hi, can everybody hear me? Okay. All right, well, thank you for organizing this, very exciting. So I looked at expressions of nationality. I prefer that term instead of nationalism. Expressions of nationality by a number of influential editors and writers in the German anarchist diaspora. From 1870 almost, I come back to that date, to 1945. so I'm basically, close reading of the anarchist press and editorials and opinion pieces by influential editors. Okay, so I'll just summarize the arguments and the evidence that led me to make those arguments. So I have sort of 4 points, I guess. So the first one is that I found these German anarchists in the US and Brazil expressed a countercultural, anti-statist, militant, anti-clerical nationality. I was drawn to this word of countercultural. Maybe it's a little too narrow, but that's what I found over this entire period. And I found the term rooted cosmopolitans, which is often used, but that seemed to fit well here as well. Where the cosmopolitan part is, of course, the internationalism and politics of solidarity, and the rooted part would be this connection to the German nation and German culture. So related to that, I also found that they, and this is probably true for many anarchist communities, they separated the meaning of nation from state. So just to be clear about sort of how I delineated this, so I'm clearly focused on the diaspora and exile communities of German anarchists. So there are, of course, non-anarchist communities out there, communists and on the liberal communities. So I really wanted to isolate what anarchists had to say about nationalism, about the German state in all its incarnations. And also, this was an interesting part about the host country, the United States and Brazil. Okay, so the second conclusion, I guess, or an argument, is that I found that a lot of these anarchist editors and activists, they used a brand of nationality as a form of opposition politics. And this was particularly so during the 1930s with the rise of the Nazis. And this is true in the US and especially in Brazil. So there is a fairly large German exile and immigrant community in southern Brazil, in Rio Grande do Sul. And so this opposition politics comes about. So it's somewhat different than I think in the 19-teens or in the 19th century, because of the Nazi politics of Gleichschaltung, which is this hard to translate word, but it's I kind of want to translate it as, bringing or forcing into line. I'm sure it's familiar to many of you. It's sort of a cultural politics, and Nazi groups would do the same would do the same abroad. So I can go further into this, but it's really at the grassroots level where Nazi groups would sort of infiltrate cultural organizations of German immigrants, mostly left organizations, and there is this contested space of German national identity. And the anarchists are very active in that, in presenting this alternative identity. So there is much more to that, but that's sort of my second conclusion. The third one is that I found a remarkable consistency in the commentary of all these editors and pieces of writing over this almost 75 odd years. So these are commentaries on the German state, whether it's the Weimar Republic or the Second Empire or the Third Reich. So I thought it was interesting of a consistency of presenting this countercultural nationality. I also found the whole phrase of seeing like a state by James Scott very, very applicable. So what anarchists would do constantly is sort of is exposing state projects and telling people stop seeing like a state. It's sort of it comes out in many different ways of reporting on state crimes, for example, in the Third Reich. So that I was drawn to that sort of image. And maybe the last thing that sort of came to me at the end of it has to do with this long period that I embarked on. It's almost 75 years from the beginning of Germany's Second Reich in 1871, to the end of the Third Reich in 1945. And it sort of occurred to me that, you know, I look at about 8 or so influential editors from this entire period, and I would argue, so I get a lot of, you know, in discussions, I get a lot of questions from people like, so what have anarchists really contributed, you know, in history? And I realized what we have here is a long-term view, an anti-authoritarian perspective, 75 years of state formation, basically. And where anarchists, I think one of their great contributions in modern history is this actively bearing witness to the inherent dangers of any statist project. And it sort of nicely culminates with Rudolf Rocker, who was born just 2 years after the establishment of the Second German Empire, and who witnessed the destruction of fascism. And he really thought of this as a moment for a new humanism. And he recognized that now, after all this state folly, we have this defeated, humbled, and leaderless Germany that could play a role in this new building of a federation in Europe. I thought that was sort of an interesting comment. And so maybe I'll end, there's so much more, but I'll end with sort of an interesting quote from Friedrich Kniestedt, who was this activist in southern Brazil, who believed nationality. He called it, you know, true Germanness. He equated that with simply humanity. Now, out of context, this may seem like this incredibly chauvinist statement, but he was really talking about this alternative kind of view of a countercultural nationality. So I think that's probably enough for now. So thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, it's great. Thank you very much. We go now to Matt Adams from Loughborough University. He's going to talk about theorizing the anti-nation, George Woodcock, anarchism, and Canadian nationalism. Microphone to you, Matt.
Thank you very much. Okay, so George Woodcock was one of anarchism's most influential, albeit controversial, historians, but he also had a secondary life in Canada as a public intellectual, and someone who was particularly concerned with the status of literature. And in this article, I tried to do two intertwined things. One is to examine Woodcock's relationship to anarchism after he moved from Britain to Canada in 1949. And the second is to think about how this anarchism shaped his reaction to Canadian politics, especially debates about the future and identity of the nation. Now, the first part reflects on the idea, an argument that Woodcock broke from anarchism once he left Britain. And my general argument is that while he grew increasingly distant from any organised movement, anarchism remained a crucial part of his intellectual identity. And this is reflected in his avowal of a of a philosophical anarchism in the 1950s is the term that he used for it, a position that he set out as seeing anarchist objectives as noble but not immediately likely. And he argued that anarchist ideas might best be thought of, therefore, as a kind of measure by which to judge existing social relationships. So what I've tried to do is consider his reading of Canadian politics through this lens. Woodcock ends up becoming a distinguished literary figure in Canada. He's sometimes described as Canada's first man of letters. He's notable for promoting the work of a number of young Canadian writers, amongst them Margaret Atwood, and he also helps found the journal Canadian Literature in 1959. And these activities coincided with a period of reflection in Canada about the nature of Canadian identity that tended to cut across four areas. One of those was the weakening colonial connection with Britain. One was the relationship with the United States. Another was the status of Canada's Francophone citizens. And the fourth was the status of its Indigenous population. This period also saw the rise to prominence of Pierre Trudeau, who had become the 15th Prime Minister of Canada and served in power for 15 years. And Trudeau advanced a politics that's been described by scholars as a civic nationalism that suggested that Canada's federal model was the basis for its survival, that this federalism would blunt the challenge of sectionalism and separatism through a strong national image. And Trudeau even thought that this might be a model that was worthy of emulation for newly emerging post-colonial states in Africa and Asia. Now, Woodcock was fundamentally opposed to Trudeau's image of Canada, and he drew on his anarchism and his reading of Canadian cultural history to develop this case. The key point here is that he thought that Trudeau's federalist model was anything but federal. He saw it as an attempt to centralise power in Ottawa with a fundamentally assimilatory intent. And using the development of Canadian literature as an index, Woodcock thought the nation's cultural history pointed to a very different solution. So Woodcock's basic theory about the development of Canadian literature that he saw flourishing, particularly in the 1940s and 50s, was that the weakening of the colonial connection to Britain and to France was key here, and that Canadian writers had started to find quote, a form and diction appropriate for rendering the texture of Canadian life. Now, what's interesting about Woodcock's argument there is that typically this kind of argument about the development of a national canon tended to support a type of Canadian nationalism that pointed to state formation and an effort to what Sarah Course describes as stabilising and unifying diversity. But Woodcock inverted this logic. He argued instead that the flourishing of Canadian literature was a product of a regional idiosyncrasy that the state, with its tendency to centralisation and control, would always subvert and ultimately destroy. So from this perspective, one that was shaped by his philosophical anarchism in its conception of federalism, regionalism, and hostility to the state, Trudeau's project was not a model worthy of emulation. And Woodcock offered instead, in a 1972 essay, the image of the anti-nation as an alternative. This mounted to what Woodcock deemed a truly federal system, characterised by highly localised democracy, expansive practice of mutual aid, and he argued that this would nurture an anti-assimilationist cultural ethos that was appropriate to Canada's variety. So, to conclude, I think Woodcock does a couple of interesting things here. He offers an argument about Canadian cultural development that usually informed nationalist and statist conclusions, but he decouples nation from state in this argument to point in a different direction. Canada's literary flourishing highlighted regionalism and diversity, not centralisation. He then used this position to attack Trudeau's civic nationalism as an inherently centralising project. And taken together, I would argue at this point to the fact that far from his emigration to Canada amounting to a break with his anarchism, it remained the bedrock from which he assessed politics and cultural life. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. We now move to Ivana Margarucci from the Consejo Nacional de Investigación Científicas y Técnicas de la Argentina. Hopefully the present pronunciation is not bad. She's going to present a paper that is titled A Fatherland Worth Living in, Anarchism, Citizenship and Nation in Bolivia, 1900-1941. Microphone to you, Ivana. Thank you.
Well, hello to everyone. My name is Ivana, and as Marco said, I'm an Argentine historian, but well, as you can see from the title of my article, I focus on Bolivian history. The paper I'm presenting here today analyzes the particular role played by anarchism in early 20th century discussions concerning the Bolivian nation and citizenship. Based on a diverse corpus of documents gathered during my doctoral research on Bolivian anarchism, I argue that between the 1920s and 1940s, the local anarchist movement took part in these debates on the Bolivian nation and citizenship by rejecting the Creole oligarchy's definition of the nation as an exclusive white or at best mestizo masculine nation and proposing one of its own. Ideologically, this intervention meant imagining a different, more inclusive national community made up of racialized and gender identities. And in practical terms, it implied fighting against internal colonialism, struggling for equal citizenship, and defending ethnic and gender identities and the human dignity of mestizo artisans, working class women, cholas, and indigenous peoples that were enrolled in or sympathized with the anarchist federations at the center of this study. I mean the Local Workers Federation and the Female Workers Federation of La Paz and the Labor Workers Federation of Oruro. But how did they do that? Well, using the only language they knew, union organization, street fighting, and the manifesto. So in the article, I reconstruct the oligarchic debates of the 1910s that can be summarized in one question: what to do with that Indian other, with Indians, and alternatively mestizos. Transform them so they can fit, never truly be included in the oligarchic nation. That was the answer. And then I addressed some anarchist ethnoclassist struggles of the 1920s and the 1930s. They're defined as the processes of political mobilization that involve identity and cultural affirmation led by a social subject forged during these processes at the intersection of class, race, and gender. Ethnoclassic struggles such as the one led by cooks, florists, and food vendors, cholas, or by the mestizo artisans in alliance with indigenous people against the multiple classist, racist, and patriarchal abuses they all suffer in their workplaces, the streets, the workshops, the hacienda. Finally, regarding the Chaco War waged against Paraguay between 1932 and 1935, I examined the opposition to that conflict and the redefined notion of nationhood proposed by anarchism in the wake of People's War effort. This exercise aims to approach the anti-colonial orientation of Bolivian anarchism, and I would say more generally to examine a historical case in which subaltern subjectivities intervened in nation building away, distanced from a status Western and patriarchal path. In conclusion, I would say that anarchists in Bolivia, those who didn't see a contradiction in defining themselves and fighting as Bolivians, defended a radicalized definition of the nation that questioned the very foundations of the oligarchic republic. The fatherland worth living in La Patria Digna de Ser Vivida, proclaimed in 1927 by the Chola anarchist cook Rosa Rodriguez, meant the emancipation of humanity, meant the revolution. It was a nation to come in all these aspects, but also a present project, a here and now, since the intense activity of anarchist labor organizations represented the de facto exercise of citizenship that was denied in law. As I argue in the introduction of the paper, the concept of the Bolivian laboratory help us understand both its recent and early 20th century history, because the experiment conducted in the first decades of the past century shows how the anarchist discourse became attractive to racialize and gender mestizo, cholo, and indigenous identities who were excluded from the Bolivian nation and republic by the liberal state. The original result of this experiment is that during the process, anarchism lost part of its universalism and became particular. That anarchism met with the nation and became anti-colonial. I would like to quickly close these ideas by thanking the invitation to participate in this thematic session. I learned a lot, and all the people who helped me during the hard process of writing in English. I'm a Spanish native speaker. An article that, in the end, attempts to recover and problematize a historical case, such as the Bolivian one, often forgotten in global North and global South historiographies, but at the same time very, very relevant for reflection on these and other issues. Thank you very much, then.
Thank you very much, Ivana, for bringing the contribution from Latin America. We're now moving back to Europe with José Antonio Gutierrez again from Université Libre de Bruxelles and Universidad y Santo Tomás de Colombia. His paper has been co-written by Jordi Martí Font from Universitat Rovira i Virgili, but the paper is presented today only by Jose. Is on the Anarchist in Catalonia, October 2017. Microphone to you, Jose. Thank you.
Hello, Marco. Thanks for the introduction. I apologize, first of all, for those of you who didn't hear at first the start, for not having the camera turned on, but it's not working. And fortunately, I got the drilling stopped. I managed to get the workers to go to the pub for a few minutes while I give this presentation. So that worked fine in the end. But and also Jordi was not, he couldn't make it here today because obviously English is not a language that he uses at all. So obviously there was no point for him being here in a meeting in a language that's completely alien to him. So yeah, we explored the links between nationalism and anarchism in the event of October 2017, when there was this big mass of people voting and participating in a referendum demanding the independence of Catalonia from Spain. That was, I'm not going to refer to the event as such because we all saw them on the news, we're all familiarized with them. It was all over the place, and I'd say it was possibly one of the biggest challenges or nationalist challenges to the European states in decades, at least since the Good Friday Agreement in the late 90s. So it was a very momentous, very faithful event, and tons of ink have been written about this event, and there's been scores, hundreds of papers about it. But all those papers, although they take very diverse positions and divergent positions, some of them say that the movement was illegitimate, some of them said that it was an intrinsically democratic movement. They take various different positions, but they all have one thing in common. And the one thing in common is that they ignore the role of anarchists in Catalonia. So our paper tried to fill that gap, and it's the first paper that actually referred to anarchist participation in the Catalonia events. Now, mind you, the participation of anarchists was not on the fringes. It was a major event, and actually it was anarchists who organized 2 days after the referendum the biggest national strike in post-Francoist history in Spain. It was the CGT, it was the CNT, it was Solidaridad Obrera. They were at the vanguard of that strike that actually was a very important moment, and it kept this momentum of those who wanted to secede from Spain going. So we wonder, well, how was this ignored? And obviously the main culprit, we think, is this sort of state-centric approach taken usually by nationalist studies and nationalism studies, that they tend to read political moments. They see them, I'm going to paraphrase here Scott and Tom Goyens, they see them as states. They see them as it was one state, Spain, and there was this state in the making, which is Catalonia, confronted. And they ignore the complexities and the many possibilities and opportunities of the moment. So this let's say very contingent alliance between anarchists and nationalists, unlikely as it may seem, we say that it's rooted in three main issues. Okay, so one issue was it was rooted on the state response. Basically, as the independentist movement started gathering momentum, there was a mounting repression against the movement, and the repression was expressed on a day-to-day basis on the streets by just mobilizing huge numbers of police and trying to block the referendum from taking place. And then the people started obviously reacting against this in attempt of suppressing this movement, okay, the process as it was called. Secondly, by blockading the institutional channels through which Catalan nationalism tended to express themselves and to enter into dialogue with the central authorities. So the moment that the autonomous institutions of Catalonia are dissolved is the moment where these traditional channels were simply cut off. These things obviously created a situation in which you had to confront repression, but you had no institutional channels to do it. So I'm going to come back to that later, to the anarchist toolbox, but obviously that created a moment in which the collaboration or the convergence between anarchists and nationalists, particularly left-wing nationalists, and in particular one party, the CUP, which is a sort of new left nationalist party, found ground to cooperate and to converge in this juncture. Secondly, there was a history. Let's say that the state response was in many ways typically Spanish. It was not the first time that massive repression and the blockading of institutional channels was applied against a particular group of people. And in particular, Catalonia had seen situations as such from the 19th century onward. And there was a common history of collaboration between anarchists and nationalist republicans based on common enemies. So the common enemies, as you may imagine, were monarchy, the central stage, in many variants of Republican nationalism, but hardly all, but in some of them, anti-clericalism was a big point of overlap as well, a strong point of overlap with the anarchists, okay? But there was not only common enemies, there was also some, let's say, affirmative overlaps as well. And one of them was, for instance, federalism. Okay, federalism has been very strong in some variants of Catalan nationalism, in particular because of some key figures like Pi Margall. Pi Margall was one of the leading early sort of Catalan federalist republicans, but he was also a man who was heavily influenced by Proudhon, and most of Proudhon's work was translated into Spanish by Pi Margall, who therefore later had a prominent role within the federal Republican Catalans. So, and he had a very prominent role as well in the First Republic of 1873. So obviously there were figures like him that allow for this interaction, and also the fact that Catalan nationalism was never an ethnic nationalism, was always more civic in nature. You know, there was this distinction made about nationalism that bark and nationalism that bite. Certainly, Catalan nationalism was not inviting group. So to speak, it was a sort of non-ethnic, more civic nationalism that could speak to some of the universalist tenets of the anarchist ideology. And last but not least, a third element that allowed for this collaboration between left-wing nationalists and anarchists was protracted interactions between both movements over the last few decades. One of the elements that allowed that interaction was a number of anti-government demonstrations and demonstrations against particular policies pushed by the central government, and that was very clear over the last 20 years when some neoliberal reforms were advanced and cuts were applied to a number of social services, and that made the left-wing Catalanistas, the left-wing Catalan nationalists, converge with anarchists in a number of these protests. Also, the rise of the Indignados movement. Okay, so you had the sort of the Occupy Wall Street movement. The Spanish version of it was the Indignados, and the Indignados also created this momentum in which anarchists and left-wing nationalists found themselves, particularly young fellas, found themselves on the streets, but also they found themselves applying similar tactics, direct action, applying occupations, applying forms of non-institutionalized mobilization, and that created a momentum for this collaboration. Okay, also this collaboration was possible because of the trade union work. Anarchists in Spain do not have parties, but they have very strong trade unions, in particular the CNT, the CGT, and the CUP, and there was a lot of collaboration between some of these CUP members in particular, that many of them were also members of some of these anarchist-led, anarcho-syndicalist trade unions. Like, and we got some facts on that. For instance, after, for instance, the 2012 election, 55% of CUP councillors of this left-wing Catalan Nationalist Party, 55% of the councillors were also members of the CGT, of one of the anarchist-led trade unions. Okay, in a town called Mieres, the mayor was a member of both the CUP and the CNT. And in Olot, which is the CNT stronghold at the moment in Catalonia, many CUP members were also affiliated to it. Okay, so there was this collaboration that was mostly experienced out of Barcelona, and I think that taking in relation to Catalan anarchism and Catalan nationalism, taking a Barcelona-centric approach also conceals these links that were most strong in places like Reus, Lleida, Tarragona, in Terrassa, where actually anarchists and nationalists very often shared the same squat houses and shared some social centers as well. Also, there were interactions between what I call the industrial base of support of both movements. Both the CUP and the anarcho-syndicalists were very strong among teachers, civil servants, public service workers, and precarious workers. And in the case of Lleida, they were also very strong in the among agricultural workers and smallholders. So there were actual places where there was an industrial cooperation that built up over the years, and all those things that many of them were very contingent, and many of them do not necessarily reflect a sort of in-depth sort of theoretical approach, but it was a very contingent approach based on places, people, networks. You have situations like that the central state decided to block the institutional channels that made this cooperation not only natural but also necessary for both movements in a way. Although the ideology was important, because, as I said, the civic nature of it and in many cases the federalist emphasis of it allowed for this collaboration. And last but not least, and I'm going to finish with this because I'm aware time it's running fast. What the anarchists brought to the movement was mostly, and I think that this is very important, a toolbox, a repertoire of struggle that was much needed to Catalan nationalism at the time that their institutional channels were closed and there was no way for them to mobilize in their more institutionalized ways, they were left with direct action. And it was there that the anarchists were at in their prime, so to speak. They were in their element, so they could come out and bring skills to the struggle that were necessary and were needed back then. And obviously the culmination of all this was the general strike of the 3rd of October of 2017 that would not have taken place without the anarchist participation. And we need to really emphasize that. And we've read a number of documents, including electoral results and all that. And it seems it's something that we will need to test in the future with more robust methods. But I would say that the strike, and we claim that in the paper, the strike actually broadened the appeal of the movement outside the traditional middle classes that were represented in most of these Catalan nationalist parties, and brought it to the working class and the riff-raff, so to speak. So it really broadened up the popular appeal of the movement. So that was the anarchist contribution in this case. So taking all of this together, it's surprising that the role of anarchists has not been explored in many of the accounts of the process of 2017. But at the same time, we think that it was very timely that we put this work together, because we really think that this gives a complete different perspective of whatever happened those days and why the movement radicalized in the way it did. So I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Jose. We now move to the last paper by Pietro Di Paola, University of Lincoln, who wrote this paper together with Constance Bantman from the University of Surrey, and is titled Banal and Everyday Internationalism, French and Italian Anarchist Exiles in London, 1870s-1914. To you, Pietro. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone, also to the conveners, and thank you to Constance, with whom I work with, and she's not here, but yeah, she's is a pity. But the article is focuses on French and Italian refugees in London between the 1880s up to the First World War, and the fact to looking at political refugees then implies that we had to consider also a kind of two different nations, the host and the home nation, at the same way, and what that meant for the political refugees and the anarchist refugees, and how these affected their national identity and national belonging. Also, the investigation tried to apply to a framework that is classical of nationalist studies, so banal nationalism and everyday nationalism, and see what these could add to the study of anarchists, but at the same time, if this the study of anarchists can suggest something to nationalist studies as well. So we applied the framework of banal nationalism as an ideology, and everyday nationalism as the daily practices in which nation and nationhood are enacted. And through this, basically, has allowed to complicate the vision of anarchists as a monolithic group of ideological internationalist group with a complete rejection of the nations, revealing a much more complex and ambivalent relationship of the anarchists toward the idea of nation, and highlighting the tension between internationalism and everyday nationalism in a way. So it shows the way in which a kind of dichotomy on the way in which the anarchist refugees imagine themselves as part of a transnational community, a cosmopolitan transnational community, but at the same time with a very close relation with national community of immigrants living in a foreign country, although there are differences that I think also should be expanded about the differences between Italian and French refugees. So the critique of nationalism remained the main, very important point among the anarchists in refugees. So the construction and the demystification of nationalist rhetoric was a key aspect of the anarchist refugees in London and their written production. They exposed patriotism and national identity as constructed and exploited by the ruling classes to reinforce their power. And they counterposed their international ideas. This was done, I think the point is that this was done clearly in their propaganda, but also sources that in a way were looking at daily life that could be considered as anecdotal, if you don't look in that sense, acquired a different meaning when you use that as in this context. And anarchists use a number of challenge this kind of national rhetoric by, for example, use of counter symbolism that were kind of subverting the national symbols, both in relation to the French Republic and the new Italian state. So this is the kind of conscious challenge of what would be a form of banal nationalism. I don't know, for example, for the Italian case, the use of martyrs, of anarchist martyrs, in contraposition of heroes of the Italian Risorgimento and the symbol of the new Italian state. Critique to nationalism was mainly directed to the home country, but then you have also example of criticism of nationalism to the host country, and that the question is to what extent to be migrants facilitated to identify this way of banal nationalism in England. But at the same time, the point is that at the same time, the anarchists in the daily life engage and enacted form of nationalism, of nationalist belonging, nationally belonging. So while they were ideologically and politically challenging the idea of nationalism, in their daily life, they still contributed in some way to the production of the nation, of their own nation. So there are ways in which the persistence of the nation emerge in their daily life. Clearly, the first example is language and the use of Italian and French and the use of monolingual. The fact that we're living in the Italian and French quarters in London, so they were following this kind of strong connection with the migrants communities. In the case of the Italian anarchists, the use of Italian as a definition of their group. So they organized the Italian club, the Italian Università Popolare, the Italian Popular University. So why they used the term of Italian was, and even if this was instrumental to attract the migrants, still, I think is revealing of an unconscious enforcement of national belonging and nationhood. As I said, for the Italian migrants, there was, for Italian refugees, Italian anarchists, there was a strong link with the Italian community of migrants. And use also of the institution of the Italian state, like the beneficenza, the consulate that was helping, providing support for migrants in financial difficulties. They were using it. While instead the French had a much less strong, less connection with the community, the French community in London. They regard themselves more as refugees, political refugees. And that, I think, is something that could be expanded in relation to the way in which the national to the way in which the nation affected the emergence of the anarchist movement, and the differences between Italy as Risorgimento, so this kind of the relationship with the Republican in Italy and the Republic and the state and the monarchy, and the legacy of the Risorgimento and the struggle for national unification, compared with the Republic in France, for example. So I think the main point is that although the sense of a national belonging remain among the anarchist refugees, at the same time they were able to express and challenge and construct a different imaginary of this against the state and the nation state. So we're consciously challenging a form of banal nationalism, while remaining attached to their kind of home, still maintaining some form of national belonging in some way. And so they felt part of this international community, transnational community. They reinforced that, but at the same time, they were kind of, you have this kind of, ambivalence of being part also of the national community and engaging with national communities. The other point is, I think,
Pietro, sorry, I'm conscious of the time. Can you wrap up in 1 minute, please?
Yeah, I finished. I think the main point also is that going back to the idea that the study of everyday nationalism is hiding the power of banal nationalism in showing the power of the state. I think that studying the anarchists show the everyday nationalism of the anarchists help also to this kind of show that they were able to build a different imaginary, and therefore there is actually not such a big contradiction between, for the anarchy studies, between banal and everyday nationalism approach.
Thank you, Pietro. Yes, we didn't lose too many people. There are still people in the room. So this is the time for you. If you have any comments or questions, as I mentioned at the beginning, if there are also any comments or questions from the contributors to other papers. I do personally have a curiosity, but let's see if anyone first in the room has any question or comments. You can open the microphone and ask the question, or as I put it, you can ask in the chat, either way. While waiting for the people, let me then ask the question, and people can have obviously think, and then so we can save time. So I'm particularly curious about the point, because I'm trying here, I come mainly from nationalism studies, let's put it this way. And I find it particularly interesting, not surprising, but at the same time it's interesting, the decoupling between the nation and the state, something which I think is the main tenet I would expect from an anarchist perspective. But if I look at this point, particularly from what is the main paradigm in nationalism studies, which is modernism, which maintain, to put it simply, that basically the nation is the product of the state. It's not so simple, but basically is the state basically produce the nation. So if this is the case, then I wonder, exactly because anarchism put in question that link. Where do they see the nation originating from? Do they still see as a product of the state, or do they see coming out from another context? What would be that context? So that would be the first question. And related to that, I think, is the question, what is the nation for anarchists? Do they define it? What is it? Is just a discourse? Is it filled? Is it imbued with some substantive elements? What are they? So how do they conceive the nation? What is the nation for them? And particularly nowadays, we are engaging so much with issues of race, ethnicities. He has been touched previously in some paper, but I wonder what is the take, the anarchist take on these big issues, because particularly nowadays, race, ethnicity are so central in the new rise of neo-nationalism. And so I still wonder what is the space of race, ethnicity within the anarchist thought. And lastly, all the papers except for Jose were very much historical papers. And when Jose brought the contribution of anarchists nowadays, it seems to me, but maybe I'm wrong, is mainly about a practical accomplishment, knowing the gear, knowing the tools, how to mobilize people, etc. But I'm thinking conceptually, what is the take nowadays of the anarchist thought on the nation? Is it the same? Are we basically discarding the nation? Are we still engaging with the nation? So more theoretically and conceptually, what is the take on anarchism? Stop here. I'm conscious that it's big. There are many. I see Jose has the hand raised. Yeah. Anyone? Yeah. Thank you.
Probably I'll come in here, and then others can add their own views. So I found very juicy questions, and I'll jump probably on two of them. The first one in relation to what is the anarchist concept of nation, and that has to be rooted in very historical terms, in the sense that some of the forerunners of anarchism were coming themselves from republican traditions. They were coming themselves from nationalist traditions in some cases. I mean, most of the Italian anarchists, for instance, the original batch of anarchists that gathered around Bakunin, came from the Risorgimento struggle or from liberal clubs that were quite republican. So I mean, like, the view of I mean, I would say that there's not a single sort of canon about in anarchism about the nation. A nation, it's tended to be treated most as a natural fact in most cases. So nations exist, and there's not much of a reflection into what is the origins of them, except probably for Rocker in nationalism and culture, where he actually says that nations are the product of states, and that's the way he puts it. But it's a bit unique, and if you compare it with the 19th century anarchism, if you compare it to Kropotkin, to Bakunin, they all start from the perspective nation geographies, and they do exist. And anarchists, instead of trying to understand how to solve the national question in a way, they try to solve the issue of how people can coexist without one dominating another. And that's the main focus of their concern, so to speak. So that would be my first contribution in your first question. And if others want to jump in, they're obviously very welcome to do so. And about today, you're not wrong in the sense that I think that practicalities really made anarchist participation made difference in the case of Catalonia. But that was also linked to a vision of a vision of what the nation could be as well. And they were linking, for instance, independence to self-management, and that resonated with sectors of left-wing Catalan nationalism that did not want to see the creation of a new bourgeois republic. And I think that those things really resonate. I remember interviewing a guy from the CUP. Remember asking him, so what is anarchism for you today? What's its role today? And he stared and said, well, I think that as a left-wing nationalist, I'd say that anarchism is actually in Catalonia a part of our national identity. And I thought that the response was absolutely baffling, but the man was very honest about it. He said, I mean, there's been so many anarchists here. It's been such a big part of our history. So although I'm talking about a contemporary process, still the shadow of that long history, it's pretty much there, and they viewed it that way. But I think that there was as well this idea, and I'm going to take Kubit here as well, the idea of nation not as a very ambivalent kind of notion, in the sense that it's not a finalized product. And yes, the modernist paradigm might be dominant in nationalism studies, but nations are pretty much a product of contention. And from that perspective, the idea of imagining a nation outside of the state and imagining federations of people united by their free will, united by free pact, as opposed to the domination of state structures, is something that's particularly alluring to emancipatory movements. So you can see that, for instance, among the Kurdish, obviously, and that's very unfortunate that we could not get a Kurdish paper for this special issue. But I think that there it's one of the places where you can see a project that has a lot of overlaps with the anarchist imagination. Okay, it's not necessarily anarchist, but it drew a lot from Murray Bookchin, from some contemporary anarchists, about how to imagine a peaceful coexistence between very diverse people in a highly contentious context, as it is the Middle East today. How you can bring them together to live peacefully and to coexist in viable institutions. And they come to the conclusion that the state actually limits that possibility. So I think that would be my response maybe to the second question. So I would leave it open now, the floor to others.
Yeah, thank you very much. I do appreciate your answer. I mean, it would be interesting because you were asking the question, what is anarchism in Catalonia? For me, it would be interesting, what is Catalonia for an anarchist? But you also mentioned the people. It's also interesting, what is the people? How is the people defined? But let's move now to Tom, because I see Tom, and then there is Kenyan. Tom, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just to respond to the question, it's a great question. Like, so what did anarchists think the nation was? What I got from this almost 75-year kind of span, this would be the German diaspora view of it, is that there's really a flexibility to this idea of nation, which they often connect to nationality. And so one aspect is as a sense of belonging. Eric Musheim writes about this really nicely. That's what it is. It's a sense of belonging. And the other aspect is that it can be connected to territory, but it's cultural, it's historical, but without hard borders in some fashion. So but the other thing, and this is really what came out of what I looked at, is that it's portable. So this idea that nation and nationality, it can be detached from a territorially defined area. And so in that sense, you see a lot of commentary on sort of the German cultural intellectual heritage that fuses with sort of an internationalism. And that's what you see in the diaspora, where we are, our nationality is sort of rooted in that sense, but even though we are living in Brazil or the United States. And it's true, Rocker does sort of seem to be this other voice where he's like, no, the nation is also a product. It's like this cunning ideology basically produced by an authoritarian state. But there's sort of an interesting, I'll end with this, but there's an interesting quote from Rocker where he says, I celebrate all the achievements of intellectual greatness and culture in this land, which he means is Germany. But then he notes that the greatness that greatness has occurred during Germany's era of national fragmentation. So sort of locating it before it all basically went to hell with, you know, creating this empire in the 1870s. National unity and contrast led to the downfall of German culture, the triumph of militarism and insipid bureaucracy, and prepared the way for the nation to be whipped into the Third Reich like a mindless herd 50 years later. So he sits at this interesting, you know, long span. But I think what I'm reading here is that for him, the nation is also located in that intellectual, cultural heritage.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Tom. I mean, you mentioned the sense of belonging. Obviously, it does resonate with me, but at the same time, there is no belonging without a politics of belonging. And by politics of belonging, we mean power dynamics of inclusion and exclusion, and who is entitled to draw those lines, who has so yeah, but interesting point. I don't want to monopolize, so let's move to Kenyon. Thank you.
Yeah, so just to build a little bit off of what's already been said, there's I'm going to paraphrase the quote here, but Mikhail Bakunin writes in reference to the Polish nation that it exists when and where people consider themselves to be Poles and ceases to exist when they find other attachments. I think that really sort of sums up what anarchists generally mean when they talk about the nation, right? It's this amorphous, changeable, elective sort of attachment to a particular cultural, linguistic, historical group. It's not essentialist, it's not unchanging, and they tend to see states as trying to artificially define nations within borders and in an unchangeable and sometimes racially defined way that they reject. I think when Rocker talks about nations in his book Nationalism and Culture, he means something different. He means those types of artificially so I think when anarchists talk about nations or nationalities, that is what they mean. And they're very explicitly not defined by race, descent, right? Lines on a map, and they are changeable. I think that's a very important point. So, you know, especially when you're dealing with a cosmopolitan movement with a lot of multilingual individuals, you know, sometimes very important, like Rocker, you know, was a very important member of the Jewish anarchist movement, though he was not ethnically Jewish, but he learned to speak and write in Yiddish, and that made him part of the Jewish anarchist movement. You find, you know, certain members of the Italian anarchist movement, which is largely linguistically defined, might be Catalan, like Pedro Esteve, who was major figure in the United States in both the Italian anarchist movement and the Spanish anarchist movement, or even the larger just Spanish-speaking anarchist movement in the United States, because that was composed of Spaniards, Cubans, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and so on. So nationalism, sorry, nations and nationality were very amorphous and changeable. I think that's really key.
Great, thank you. I saw there was the hand by Matt is no longer there. Matt, do you want to step in or?
Yeah, I was going to. I'm afraid I've got to go at 5:30. I'm afraid, but Kenyon and Tom both said what I was going to say essentially. And for Woodcock, his focus was on the idea of nation as something defined by culture and geography, essentially, but that had porous boundaries, and it was should not be understood in terms of governments and frontiers and so forth.
Yeah, great, thank you. Ruth?
Sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, you know, for me, I don't think that, you know, I agree with what's been said. I mean, I don't think the nation is a thing in the same way as it is for anarchists, as it is for statists. So it's part of a mix, you know, through which people constitute themselves in their groups. And, you know, some of those, and it's, you know, it can be realized, if you like, as a result of domination. So if someone tries to repress your language, your religion, your practices, you know, you may start to think of yourselves as a group which constitutes yourselves in that way, but it's not necessary. But and I don't think, you know, when anarchists talk about self-government and constituting themselves, I mean, people like Proudhon didn't think about being French as such. I mean, he thought that actually, you know, it was interesting when he walked along the borderlands. He thought that the relationships between people on those borderlands were probably closer than they were to the sort of the capital cities. I mean, this was a way in which people interacted and constituted themselves as groups. And because of the way that state processes had operated in highly repressive ways, you know, to impose orthodoxies, to impose, you know, uniform language, impose uniform religion, that's the point at which the nation or nationality became a way of thinking about decentralizing and federating and thinking about building different kinds of relationships. But I agree. I think it's fluid. It's not a thing in the same way.
Yeah, that's great. If I want to play a bit of a provocation here, I would say that if it was not an imposed language, France would still be so fragmented; it would not exist as a nation. But yeah, it's just.
But that's the point. Who tells you who tells you what's good for you? You know, it's the people who constitute themselves and then make relationships with others.
Right.
That's the whole point. You build from the bottom up.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Sorry, I see Jose coming back. Yeah. And then there is Abel.
Yeah, no, just very quickly. I'm not going to be very long, but just to follow up on Kenyon said, you know, I mean, like we wrote a paper as well with Federico, and I just put in the chat here a quote, but it's ultimately, I mean, the principle of freedom for anarchists meant that belonging to any human group, and in particular a nation in this case, was above all an act of will. And I think that that's the most important thing, that you want to belong and you want to secede, and that's the way we finish as well the paper when we said, you know, for anarchists, secession is a prerogative of any human group at any point in time. And statist people will tell you, well, that's anarchy. And yeah, of course, that's anarchy, you know, but it's an important distinction to me about the principle of freedom, the act of will. And I think that Kenyan example of Rocker is actually quite spot on there on how can he could belong to the Jewish anarchist movement without being Jewish himself. But anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Great. Abel, sorry, you were first.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know. Yeah, I activated my micro. The camera is out. Yeah, I had a quick question, mainly to Pietro Di Paola and Tom Goyens, because it's related to the question of anarchist nationalism in the case of migration. I study myself the Italian anarchists in Egypt and Tunisia, and something that I see, a difference that I see between the two cases, is that in Tunisia we have like a clear will of emphasizing the local identity, not the Italian national identity, but even the Sicilian or Sard identity with newspapers. So I was wondering in how anarchy, because in the presentation of Pietro Di Paola, one of the main points was the different rhetoric or the alternative narrative on nationalism. But in some cases, I have the feeling in the Italian anarchists I study that anarchism can be like a clear way to nationalism. In the case of some Italian anarchists that have like a very, very clear local identity, but not a national one, and that they kind of discover their Italian nationality or identity when they're integrated in an Italian community in Egypt or Tunisia. And like one of these paths towards like a national identity, I make the hypothesis it can be done by anarchist newspapers that like talk more about Italian like politics than the other Italian newspapers do in general. So I was wondering if it was the same case, or we can see something similar in the case of Italian anarchists in London, or even German anarchists in Brazil and the US. Thank you.
I don't know, for the Italian anarchists, I think it's very interesting your point about local identities. I found that extremely interesting. But that is, I think, a link with the way in which political migration works. In the sense, in London, all the community of anarchists were already anarchists when they reached London. And so I don't know exactly the situation, as you said, in Egypt, but for example, in Argentina, the majority, according to the dictionary of a biographical dictionary of anarchists from Calabria, they mostly became anarchists once in Argentina. They were not, well, they were maybe politicized, but they embraced the. So I wonder if that had an influence of have a strong local identity before being politicized. Does it make sense? And that, I think, is the other point, that we need to consider the national differences as well when we study international, transnational, nationalist anarchism.
Yeah, thank you. Tom, do you want to come back on this point?
I'm not sure I completely understood the whole gist of the question, but I don't see really the sort of a leap to actual nationalism. I don't know if that's what you were asking. I really see this embrace of countercultural nationality. I know that's a mouthful, but that feels all the way from, you know, the 1880s, where you have this commentary on Bismarck's state and then the empire, and all the way to the Third Reich. I mean, there is obviously real resistance and sometimes violent resistance, but there is this sense that the state, in whatever incarnation, is smothering and regimenting and delineating a nationality of a German culture that is linked to an international philosophy of solidarity. And one of the editors, Hans Koch, he writes very simply, like, the state sets boundaries for the development of art, science, and ethics. That's what it does. It's just, now that I don't think that negates the anarchist sense of nationality as still somewhat territorial. It's just once you put the borders, then that's wrong. And the same with the mental sort of, that's where the Germans are abroad are fighting the Nazi Party's Gleichschaltung. I found it really interesting because, of course, inside Germany, there would have been violence against opponents of the regime. But abroad, because Germans are living in a different country, like in Brazil, for example, you have this fight against Nazi groups, but it's like there's one instance in a mutual aid society in Porto Alegre where Kneistadt makes a speech, and then there's a counter speech, and then the Nazis are kicked out. But there's no real violence. If that happened in Germany, they would have been arrested and you know, there would be violence. So you have this odd sort of peaceful fighting of ideas and identities. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Great, thank you, Tom. I see Kenyon briefly because I would like to hear if Ivana as well as a last word, because I'm conscious of the time. Thank you, Kenyon, briefly, and then if Ivana has anything.
I just wanted to jump in about your description of these Italians around the Mediterranean is very similar to what I found with Italian anarchists in Paterson, New Jersey, in the U.S., who were mostly came from Biella in you know, there's a shift away from Piedmontese to official Italian in their speaking and writing, becoming less regional and more sort of pan-ethnically Italian as a result of migration. So I think there's definite parallels.
Yeah, it's a common trait of any migrant. Anyhow, Ivana, you have any words, any things you want to add? Anything?
Well, regarding the discussion that we were having before, and your question about what is nation for anarchists, I would say that in the Bolivian case, it's not the sense of belonging, which was put by Tom, but it's the possibility itself to belong to the nation. That's what anarchists were claiming for, and they were doing in this ethnic key, yeah, like proclaiming, vindicating their ethnic identities, their denied identities, their forbidden identities, such as cholos, such as indigenous people. So I like very much the title of the article of Jose and Federico, which is called Nation Against the State, because in a sense, in the Bolivian case, I could see the same, but also see how the anarchist national identity, it is built against the national identity, the excluding, the white, the masculine patriarchal national identity provided from the state. And I think that struggles continues up to today. And you said, Marco, that most of the papers were like kind of historical, and in fact they are. But in my case, I'm always trying to think how this history illuminates the Bolivian present, which continues to be quite conflictive among the same issues. It's not casual that in 2008 Bolivia had in a very not innovative and original way its plurinational constitution.
Thank you, Ivana. Ruth, Jose, you have any last word? You introduced the roundtable. Do you have any final comments you want to make?
No, not from me. I think we sort of covered it. I think we covered it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose.
Yeah, no, I just want to have words of appreciation and gratitude for the opportunity of bringing us all together again and have the pleasure of sharing platform with these spectacular scholars, and also to engage in these debates that are very, very interesting. So thank you very much, and hopefully we take this agenda further and we have some ideas down the line, but we will be communicating them on due time. But this is the start of a conversation as opposed to the end of it, I suppose, and that's all I want to say. So thank you very much. And
very much agree. Yeah,
well.
very much agree. It's the start of a conversation. Looking forward how this can brought forward in other platforms. But for the time being, let me thank again Ruth and Jose for bringing colleagues together. Obviously, the presentation were great, so thank you very much for the contributors. Thank you also for Brigitta, who managed to put together technically this roundtable. This session was recorded, so it's going to be posted sometimes, I don't know when in the future, on the webpage of the Loughborough University Nationalism Network. Thank you very much. Have a great time, festive time, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy Christmas. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.